Good morning, everybody. Nice to see a good group of people here. Welcome to the final Debating Europe session for 2012, not the final one of this academic year. I'm delighted that we have David O'Sullivan from the European External Action Service, the EEAS, to talk about setting up the European External Action Service experiences and perspectives. I'm not going to introduce him myself. I'm going to hand over to Pasquale Ferrara to do that. But we've got, in addition to David O'Sullivan and Pasquale, we have Federica Bicchi from the LSE and currently a visiting fellow in the SPS department, and Ulrich Krotz, who's our one of our chairs of international relations here at the UI, to act as commentators on the presentation by David O'Sullivan. So thank you, Pasquale.
Yes, good morning. I think that my task will be relatively easy because David O'Sullivan doesn't sound a complete stranger to many of you around the table. He has been also a very good friend of the UI for many years. David is currently Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, and then I guess he will explain what this means in terms of running this very complicated service, because it is a new body which is meant to be autonomous but also having a functional connection with all the EU architecture. David is a prominent high official of the EU Commission, has been before joining the new External Action Service. He has been Director General for Trade from 2005 until 2010, and previously was Secretary General of the European Commission from June 2000 to November 2005. I have a lot of sympathy for this, duty. Of course, the scale was absolutely different. Being Secretary General of the Commission implies much higher responsibility. He was also head of cabinet of President of the Commission, the President of the Commission, Romano Prodi. And I remember him in that capacity because at that time I was serving at the Italian representation to European Union in Brussels. We didn't interact much because I was dealing with other institutional issues. And also he has been Director General for Education and Training. So I guess you understand very well an educational institute has like this one. David has a background in economics, and he graduated from the Trinity College in Dublin, and then completed postgraduate studies at the College of Europe in Bruges. He holds an honorary doctorate from the Dublin Institute of Technology, and also member of the consultative board of the Institute for International Integration Studies at Trinity College in Dublin. Now, David will speak for approximately 20-25 minutes, and the topic is quite interesting: setting up the European External Action Service, experiences and perspectives. And I guess that this audience is interested in both elements, of building up a new structure, and also what are the perspectives on this original body that was created by the Treaty of Lisbon, and also that has been discussed also during the Constitutional Convention. So it is very much in the mind of member states and the European other European institution. So, David, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to deliver a Debating Europe lecture on the setting up of the European External Action Service. I have, as Pasquale said, a long association with the Institute, and I'm very pleased to continue that today. I'm also pleased to have the opportunity to talk about what I think is a very interesting subject, which is the creation and the future perspectives for the External Action Service. I have, as Pasquale has hinted, a slightly sort of varied career, starting out indeed as a diplomat in the Irish Foreign Service a long time ago. So I'm a sort of lapsed diplomat, but I had to renew my subscription. And I often say that I'm reminded when I once heard Pascal Lamy, the Director General of the WTO, saying that his experience of moving from the national administration in Paris to the European administration in Brussels, where he was head of cabinet to President Delors, and then to the international arena of the WTO, that he felt the national was the solid, the European was liquid, and the international was gas. Now he was very careful not to say hot air, but I'm to a certain extent going through the same experience of finding myself towards the end of my career dealing with what I started out with, which is the whole issue of international relations, which is certainly much more challenging to come to grips with than some of the more concrete issues that you can find yourself dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the EU. I'm also wanted to just recall where all this came from, because in fact, you never know what happens to you in life. I had since you're all relatively young students, I'll pass you on words of wisdom that were given to me by an Irish commissioner that I once worked for, Pádraig Flynn, who said, always be nice to the people you meet on the way up, because you are quite likely to meet the same people on the way down. And it's also true that little did I know when I was in the European Convention debating the creation of this new External Action Service that I would one day find myself having to run it. So you never know what life holds for you. And it is worth recalling that in the convention, why was this regarded as such an important issue? Because I think it was a recognition that if the initial driver of European integration was peace and reconciliation in the immediate aftermath of the war, and if you like, if the second phase driver of European integration was the reunification of the continent, starting with bringing into the then EEC the countries emerging from dictatorship, Greece initially in 1981, Spain and Portugal later in 1986, and of course the big enlargement to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in 2004. I think already during the convention people could see that the big challenge for Europe and the big driver of integration was going to be Europe in the world. How was Europe going to assert its values and its interests in a rapidly changing global environment where the tectonic plates are shifting and power and influence is shifting dramatically. And the only way we could do this was by speaking with one voice. And so the first modest step that people wanted to do was indeed to create a personality, an institutional figure, combining the role of Vice President for External Relations of the Commission and the High Representative role occupied by Xavier Solana, and to give this person a new diplomatic service to underpin their work, which was the External Action Service. Now, of course, at that time I was Secretary General of the Commission, and I spent a lot of my time with my good friend Paolo, who's also there, defending the notion that this service should be an integral part of the Commission. We didn't win that battle, perhaps not unsurprisingly, but we fought a good fight. But it was clear that member states were not going to accept that this body would simply be an integral part of the Commission. So it had to be some kind of sui generis entity. And this is more or less what it has become. But of course, the history after the convention, you all know, the constitution, the referenda which blocked that, the then subsequent rewriting of the content of the constitution into the Treaty of Lisbon, which in turn was blocked by a referendum in Ireland and the need for a second referendum, all of which meant that none of the preparatory work that should normally have been done to prepare the launching of this new service took place. In any rational world, you would have had a team of people working for several years to design how this new service was going to be set up, and when you push the button after the ratification of the Treaty of Lisbon, you would immediately have had a clear understanding of what needed to be done. Of course, we don't do things that way in Europe, and that is not what happened. So Cathy Ashton found herself appointed High Representative Vice President in December of 2009. Overnight, the EU, the Commission delegations in third countries immediately became EU delegations, and the rest of the service was left in limbo because it needed a council decision to set it up. And one of Cathy's first tasks, which was not, I think, what she expected, was she had to spend a lot of time in Brussels in meetings with ministers and parliamentarians trying to get this decision through instead, of course, of being Europe's voice in the world. The initial impact was a lot of internal infighting to decide how we were going to create this service. In fact, I think she did a remarkable job in managing to get agreement on the decision to set up the service in July 2010, getting a good decision, not easy, with member states and of course the Parliament and the Commission all wanting to have their say in this process and all having their ideas about how this new service should function. And it was basically agreed that this new service would start on the 1st of January 2011, and myself and Pierre Vimont were appointed in November with the task of putting this all together. I can assure you that when we arrived, we were faced with blank sheets of paper, blank desks, and a considerable challenge. So it is not surprising that certainly the first year of our existence was largely dominated by the challenges of putting together this new service administratively, bringing together staff from the Commission, all the people working in the area of external relations in what was then called DG Relics. I was the last Director General of DG Relics for 3 weeks, were transferred en masse into this new service. Anecdotally, we all received a very nice letter from the head of personnel towards the end of December. I got one. Mine was personally delivered to me, but I got the same letter as everybody else, saying, "Dear Mr. Sullivan, we'd like to inform you that on the 1st of January you are herewith transferred to the External Action Service. We would like to thank you for your contribution to the work of the Commission and wish you success in your future career." This seemed like a fairly sort of cold goodbye from the Commission to this brave new world of the External Action Service. The Council managed it slightly better by actually giving people a choice as to whether they wanted to stay or go. They were dealing, of course, with smaller numbers of people. And the first thing I discovered when I arrived was that both sets of people, and then, of course, we also had member state diplomats who were going to join us, that all three sets had very different perceptions of what had happened. For the Commission colleagues, they felt they had been cast out of the warmth of the Commission womb into the outer darkness of intergovernmentalism. The Council Secretariat colleagues felt that their worst nightmare had come true and they had woken up and were now actually working for the Commission. And the member state diplomats found that they had landed on planet Europe, where neither the atmosphere nor the language represented anything they had recognized coming from a national diplomatic service. So it wasn't easy to get these three sets of people working for a common purpose, even if everyone, of course, came in the hope and the expectation that we could build something genuinely new, genuinely innovative. And I think this has been the big challenge of the last 2 years. I think we have a lot to show for what we've been able to do. Administratively, we have put in place all the procedures and systems necessary to function as an organization. The decision was that we are not an institution, but we are functionally independent in two important ways. We are responsible for our own staff, so we have exclusive authority over our own staff, and we are exclusively responsible, which was not necessarily a present, for our budget. So, of course, the first thing we had to do was actually figure out how we were going to manage all of this, because most of the people transferred to the organization were not doing this. This was all done for us by the central administrations of either the Commission or the Council. We were in 8 buildings across Brussels. the vast majority of colleagues for the last 18 months were actually sitting in the same office, in the same building, doing pretty much the same work a year after the creation of the service as they had been doing before it was created, which is not entirely surprising because they had all been working on external relations, so it's not as if the external relations agenda changed dramatically because of the creation of the External Action Service, but psychologically this meant that people did not have a great sense of belonging to some new organization. And it took us nearly 18 months to identify and to refurbish and move into new offices, which we have done in July, strategically placed. For those of you who know Brussels and the Rond-Point Schuman, we have taken a building which Paolo will certainly remember well, what used to be the Joyeuse Entrée, which was actually the first building of the Commission. It's where the Hallstein Commission actually sat initially. I remember when Romano Prodi was made president, we temporarily housed him indeed in Hallstein's own old office, pending his taking up office. This building was demolished and replaced with a brand new building, which is literally strategically, depending on whether you're looking down Rue de la Loi or up Rue de la Loi, but if you're looking down, the Berlaymont is on the right, and the council building, the Justus Lipsius, is on the left, and our building is in the middle, and because of the lay of the land, we're just a little bit higher than the other two. But there's no institutional conclusions to be drawn from that. Now, in the middle of all of this, of course, we then had to look at the policies. And Cathy announced that her 3 priorities were the creation of the service, which is of necessity something that has to be done. It's a bit boring, it's a bit tedious. A lot of our initial investment was spent in systems, procedures, IT systems, working out an organizational chart. This is, of course, not the reason why we exist, but like any bureaucracy, without systems and procedures, we can't function. So a lot of psychic energy went into that in the beginning. Secondly, she identified the neighborhood as a key priority, which, of course, was very prescient because in January of 2011, we had the Arab Spring. Speaking personally, I would have wished that the good people of North Africa could have waited another year before they decided to have their revolution. They could at least have let the EEAS bed down, but I understand their impatience, and they weren't exactly thinking about the impact of this in Brussels. But we had to respond to what was what I think academics would call a critical juncture event, which happened almost immediately after we were created. And then the third priority was, of course, that of dealing with strategic partners globally. And so we had to not only build the service, but we had to also deal with ongoing foreign policy activities, because these didn't stop. When I was doing the reform of the Commission with Romano Prodi and Neil Kinnock back in 2003, I sometimes used to quote the joke that of the heart surgeon who brings his Ferrari or his Maserati into a garage looking for a service, and the mechanic says, well, look at this magnificent engine, and opens the bonnet and says, look at this is fantastic. He said, and you call yourself a skilled surgeon? Look at me, I'm a mechanic, and I can work with this brilliant machine. I'm as good as you. And the heart surgeon said, yes, but try doing it with the engine running. And this is a bit how it felt with setting up the EEAS. We had to create foreign policy at the same time while we were trying to keep the machine ticking over, and frankly, it wasn't always easy to do both. Perhaps a word on the role of Cathy Ashton, because when we were in the convention, Paolo, we thought we were creating a double-hatted person, namely a vice president of the Commission and a high representative. In fact, the way things have worked out, we actually created a 4-hatted person, because not only does Cathy Ashton embody the function of High Representative, traditionally first invented, if you like, by Javier Solana, or secondly, Vice President of the Commission, but she is also takes over the rotating presidency in the Council, because the other institutional innovation is that the Foreign Affairs Council is henceforth chaired by by the High Representative, and all the working groups of the Council, which prepare the work of the Foreign Affairs Council, are chaired now by the EEAS and not by the rotating presidency. It is also true that in the third countries, the delegations of the External Action Service have taken over the role of the rotating presidency. So the rotating presidency has more or less disappeared from the scene of external relations. So this is the third function which, if you like, the High Representative Vice President and therefore the service have taken over, that of the rotating presidency. And the fourth, maybe it's 3.5, she is also responsible for defense and is the European Union, chairs the informal meetings of defense ministers and has also some responsibilities for the European Defense Agency and so forth through the CSDP. So this was actually an extremely complex new role which has been created, and frankly the full impact of putting these four elements in one person, I think, has yet to be seen and assessed. Now, I think if I say what have we succeeded in doing, I think firstly, with regard to the first priority, setting up the service, I think we've done a good job. It is there, it functions. Like any bureaucracy, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. Probably the greatest challenge is still to build some common sense of corporate identity. There is still a lingering sense of the heritage of the institutions from which we came. People tending to behave as though they were still in the Commission or tending to behave as though they were still in the Council Secretariat. I think Member State diplomats have integrated extremely well. Sometimes they're a bit perplexed by the way things get done at European level, but they're adjusting to that. But I think it will take a certain amount of time, because the risk is that we seek to define ourselves in opposition to the Commission or in opposition to the Council Secretariat. Whereas in fact, the trick, it seems to me, is that we have to manage a slight schizophrenia, that at times we function as though we're part of the Commission. At times we function as though we are the External Relations Department of the Commission. So when the Commission is preparing something on external relations or something with a strong external relations component, they turn to us. We normally write the text or we chair the meetings. But in the end, we are working inside the Commission through Cathy's Vice President role, and the product that comes out will be a text of the Commission. When we are across in the Council, running the working groups, chairing the Foreign Affairs Council, as Cathy does, we're a part of the Council Secretariat. We effectively are doing work that the Council Secretariat used to do, and we have to work very closely with them. So we need some degree of autonomy, some degree of independence, but it's not our job to be disconnected from the other institutions. It's our job precisely to try and connect the dots and to make the interplay between the institutions work better. And I could include in this the European Parliament, with whom we cooperate very closely. We have very good relations with the AFED committee, with other committees in the Parliament, the DEVE committee on development. There our role is much more clear because, of course, they accept us as the interlocutor. But we have a tension because, as an institution, we're very inclined to cooperate fully with the Parliament, also because of vested interest, because, to be frank, they're the ones who vote our budget, and believe me, my position that counts, but also because I think instinctively we feel the Parliament should be playing a role. This is not always the view of Member States, and there's a little bit of tension as to how forthcoming we are to the Parliament, and some of the Member States would prefer us to be slightly less forthcoming. So we have to manage that. But I think, in general, after 2 years, we can say we've achieved a lot. Now, on the substance of foreign policy, we were chatting earlier, and I was saying, I mean, maybe you can answer this question. One of the questions I ask myself a lot when in this job is, well, what is foreign policy anyway? What exactly do we define as foreign policy? Because certainly we've come a huge way in Europe back to the days of political cooperation. When I was first in the Irish Foreign Service in the 1970s, we had political cooperation. There are one or two people around the room old enough to remember that. What we are doing now is light years ahead of that in terms of coordination, in terms of joint action. But the fact is that the world has also changed. it is not entirely clear anymore, even nationally, what is the role of foreign ministries relative to finance ministries, economics ministries, relative to chancelleries and prime ministers' offices who increasingly do foreign policy. What is the role of national diplomats in a world where prime ministers can text each other and can send each other emails, which are not read by anyone, or where people can pick up a mobile phone and speak directly. This is dramatically changing the nature of modern diplomacy. And equally, the content is changing, because traditionally it was about treaties or about clashes over local issues. These still exist, of course. We've only to look at what's happening in the South China Sea to see how sometimes things can look scarily like situations we had 100 years ago in Europe. But in general, the content has changed. There's much more about economics, much more about trade. Look at the G20. The link between traditional foreign policy and trade issues, climate change issues, economic issues. What is really shaping the 21st century is not necessarily gunboat diplomacy or alliance creation and strategic positioning. It's also about what's happening in the real world of economics, trade, financial regulation, financial flows, and these are situations which are often beyond the control of individual governments, and even the biggest players find it difficult to assert themselves. So if I touch just briefly on some of the issues that we've had to deal with, the neighborhood policy was obviously one of the first challenges with the Arab Spring, how we responded to that. In fact, we put on the table immediately in March a proposal of a new way of dealing with the neighborhood, putting emphasis on offering the toolbox of advantages and cooperation which the EU can offer. Cathy Ashton likes to call it the 3 M's, money, mobility, markets. In other words, access to our markets, financial assistance, and the possibility of people-to-people exchanges. We were criticized a bit for not reacting quickly enough to the Arab Spring. I'm not entirely sure it was fair. We certainly were in very good company of not predicting it. And it's true we didn't predict it, but then neither did anybody else, to the best of my knowledge. Though 1 or 2 people are now pulling out academic articles they wrote months beforehand saying, oh, I predicted it. But certainly, to my knowledge, there was no government foreign ministry telling us in December or January, watch out, there's something very important happening in North Africa. And I think actually we reacted quite quickly, because it was not a situation where there could be an immediate response. Because in fact, the key thing to this movement is that people want to take ownership of their own countries. So the last thing they want is people from the outside telling them how to do it. And one of the first messages we got from the Arab countries was, please don't try and give us your off-the-peg, ready-made-to-measure constitutional ideas, democratic ideas. Let us, we're emerging from totalitarian or dictatorial regimes, and we want to take the time to figure out how we want to do this. So it's thank you for your offer, but we'd like to just work internally. And that we've been very respectful of that. But we have done a lot. Cathy has invested heavily, for example, with the task forces, bringing together all the external actors, the member state contributors, the international financial institutions, the EIB, the EBRD, and indeed private sector funding. And we've done this with Tunisia, we've done it with Jordan, and most recently in Egypt, where we are taking the lead in trying to provide support for this process of transition. But of course, it will not be simple, because we know that the democratic process, and there will be debates about how democratic some of the process is, will throw up surprises for us, and this is something we're going to have to look at very carefully. On the eastern neighborhood, of course, we completed our negotiations with Ukraine on an association agreement. Ukraine being caught in this tug of war or tug of love between Europe and Russia. But there are concerns about human rights, selective justice in Ukraine, which we feel need to be addressed before we can sign that agreement. But again, with the Eastern Partnership, we have worked very hard in also cultivating our relations with the Eastern Partnerships, with the Eastern Partnership countries. If I take the issue of the Middle East, which is of course of great actuality, There, I think Cathy Ashton has succeeded via the quartet in positioning the EU in a much better place than we were, say, 10 years ago. We're now taken as a serious political interlocutor. But this is also an illustration of some of the challenges, but I'll come back to that in a moment, just for my last few minutes to talk about perspectives, because here we do not have always a common position. When the Palestine applied for membership of UNESCO, we split three ways. There is a likelihood, a strong likelihood, that we will not be able to have a common position in relation to the vote on the issue which will take place in the General Assembly. And even on Libya, though there was a push from what was perceived as the European side, mainly by France and the UK, for some kind of intervention to protect civilians in Libya, Germany abstained. So we are always in a case of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, where we do not always have the degree of unanimity amongst our member states on these issues, which would enable us to take a strong EU position. The Western Balkans is another area where we have been extremely active, and Cathy personally is now handling the negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo. Here again, I think maybe it's the contra-example, because of course we have a number of member states who don't recognize Kosovo. On the other hand, we have a strong European position of trying to work out a deal between Serbia and Kosovo, and I think the role of the European Union in the Western Balkans in the last 5 years or so has been extremely positive, and we work very closely there also with the Commission, because these are also candidate countries. And so we have the incentive, if you like, of enlargement, which does change a bit the role of the EU in that context. And finally, perhaps I should say a word about Iran, where Cathy Ashton speaks on behalf of the E3+3, which basically means the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, where we are trying to find a peaceful and diplomatic solution to the problem of Iran's nuclear program, which has the potential completely to destabilize the situation in the Middle East. This is extremely difficult, but it's interesting to note that not only is Cathy Ashton speaking on behalf of the EU, but that it was European sanctions which actually brought Iran back to the table. We had to take some painful decisions for some of our member states, but it was those sanctions which actually created a new political reality, or economic reality, which encouraged Iran to come back to the negotiations. Now, how successful these negotiations will be remains to be seen. It's extremely challenging. But I think these are hopefully just some illustrations of the way in which we have not just been building a bureaucracy, but that we have also been trying to be active on the world stage and intervening in a positive and constructive way. The area where I think we have still work to do is in the area of the global challenges. The climate change conference is starting in Doha. How can we relate to issues such as climate change, energy, water, which is becoming an increasingly important issue? And how do we deal with the external projection of our internal policies? How can you talk about relations with Russia without talking about energy? You have, even in Central Asia, and Cathy Ashton is visiting the region, serious issues over water and the Rogun Dam. We were in Southeast Asia recently. The whole question of the Mekong Delta is an important. So how do we, as the External Action Service, connect the dots between our domestic EU policy and the external projection of that policy? And this was one of the key things which was hoped for in the convention. And I think on this, we still have more work to do. It's partly an organizational problem, because frankly, we don't have in the External Action Service all of the expertise, because these are subjects where you need expertise. But it's also a question of working out a division of labor with the Commission on how we can project a foreign policy stance, which is nonetheless consistent with what we're doing also domestically. I'm conscious that I'm probably coming to the end of the 20-25 minutes that it was suggested I should speak for, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I think if I look to the future, what I sometimes like to say is that the Treaty of Lisbon gave us new hardware. It gave us a new political personality in the High Representative Vice President, and it gave us a new service in the form of the External Action Service and, of course, in the network of delegations around the world. We have 140 delegations around the world, which are now EU delegations. This is the 7th largest diplomatic network in the world, after the US, China, France, UK, and Germany. This is a huge asset. Now, these are delegations of different nature. Many of them were initially focused mainly on aid delivery, particularly in Africa. So we're in the process now of reinforcing them with member state diplomats so that they can play the local presidency role, which is what they do, because they are now the ones who chair the meeting of member states locally, who make démarches on behalf of the EU. And this, by the way, has been a dramatic revolution. I was in the Commission delegation in Tokyo in the early 1980s, and I can tell you, if you had asked me then whether 30 years later it would be possible that the Commission delegation would be accepted as the EU delegation, that the head of the Commission delegation would effectively be the primus inter pares of the member states locally, I would never have believed it possible. And yet it has happened. And it has dramatically changed the image of Europe externally, particularly in the many countries where there are not many member states. In Washington, it's the only place where we have all 27 member states present, and I suspect they will be there for a long time. But in 100 countries, we have less than 10 member states present, and in 60 countries, we have less than 5 member states present. So as you can imagine, the existence of this network is extremely valuable and is also helping member states to change the way in which they think about their national diplomacy. So we have this new hardware. What has not changed, let us be frank, is the software. The software is basically the process by which we agree common European positions, because all of this exists in order to project, to imagine, to conceive, to get agreed, and to project common European positions. When we don't have common positions, we are in a very difficult state. And this is still arrived at by unanimity. And I think the challenge going forward will be, to what extent do the member states want to make further quantum changes in the way in which they perceive the balance between European level foreign policy, including defense issues and security issues, and national. I think it'll be a long time before the national foreign policy disappears. So I think the two are going to have to coexist for many years to come. But I do think that if we really want to have an impact as Europe, and if we want to influence and shape the 21st century, and not simply be at the receiving end of a 21st century designed by others, whether the Chinese, the Indians, or the Americans, then it is only by acting with greater cohesiveness and speaking more often, even more often than we do with one voice, and also having some capacity, some hard power capacity to intervene militarily where we believe this is justified, particularly in terms of crisis management or peacekeeping or peace conflict prevention. And that's the challenge on which I don't want to make predictions. My sense is that that's the direction in which we're moving, but I think it will take time, and there are conflicting forces pulling in different directions. But that, I do believe, and this is my final word, that the existence of the institution, and we discussed this earlier with Maurice, the existence of a well-functioning, respected external action service will not in itself change the software, but it will make, in my view, it will increase the likelihood that member states are willing to confer greater responsibility to the European level. And the inverse is certainly true. If we cannot create a professional, respected, and effective European diplomatic service able to underpin the role of the High Representative Vice President, then it is clear member states will be very reluctant to transfer responsibility and authority to the European level. So I think this is a very exciting project. I must say, I've done many things in my career. This is certainly one of the most interesting. sometimes a bit frustrating, but I'm absolutely sure that all of us who are involved in it will look back in 5 or 10 years and see this as quite a seminal moment in the development of European integration. There's a bit less focus on it now because of the euro crisis than there was in the first year, and maybe this is not a bad thing, but I still think that this is a very exciting development which I believe will change the face of European diplomacy in the years to come, and it's been a great privilege and pleasure to be a part of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that was a great start to the discussion, and I think you managed the trick of giving us a kind of an insider's view, but with a certain detachment, which allowed you to take an objective view, really, of what's been going on, which I think is very helpful. I'm going to turn straight away to our commentators, and we'll hear from them briefly. I've asked them to speak for around 5 minutes, so there should be plenty of time for discussion around the table and to hear from the rest of you as well. So I'm not sure, Ulrich, are you going first? Fine.
Does this work? Yeah. So let me second Maurice in thanking you for coming, visiting us and talking to us. It's always, I find it very refreshing to hear how the work is done, which I think is important, especially important perhaps for IR, where the risk or the habit of getting lost in grand abstractions and theory might be particularly high. So I sometimes have the thought there should be a requirement for IR scholars, should start at a doctoral level, to listen at least for 1 hour to somebody who does the work on a daily basis, at least once a month or something like that. I think we're not up at that level, but I think you cover 3 months, and I'm grateful for that. So Marisa asked us to respond very briefly, and this is exactly what I'm going to do. Maybe asking you about two areas, really, and anything that you might say or expand on those areas, on those questions. I'm pretty certain might be very interesting for us to hear and might spark more specific questions then. The first one would be perhaps more broadly or more generally how, in your view, setting up a European diplomatic corps, European diplomatic service relates to Europe's role and Europe's place in the world. This is a very broad field, I'm aware, but I think anything you might say in greater specificity yet might address one of the great questions that Europe will be facing, without questions, over the last decades, perhaps next to the set of crises that dominate the headlines these days. Now, what might that be, this effect or relate to? There are very different ways, a whole range of ways of looking at this, and let me just very quickly sketch 2 or 3 out of those. One would be kind of the Monet method. That would be you do bit by bit, and Monet probably would use the word fermentation, so it's not only what you throw in you get out, but something happens in the process. It goes slow, it's incremental, and in the end you get something. I think there was quite a bit in your presentation that you're thinking along those lines, and that's also what I understand from our conversation over coffee earlier this morning. Is this the slow-moving process where Europe is heading with this? But very interesting, your time frame, and I know this is always somewhat speculative. We quickly touched on it earlier. This is one way, so the Monet method, but there's another way, and this is not at all mutually exclusive. Another metaphor would be something like, what you're doing is really producing a tool to do something. And you know how people think about tools, you know this metaphor with a hammer. Once you have a hammer, you see nails all over the place, right? Or as some people say, if there's a hammer, there will be nails, right? So You touched on this, on the sort of giving a little tour on the current issues, but if you would dare, or if you would be willing to look over the current state of affairs, what you think might be the main nails for the tool. And you used a different metaphor. I think you touched on this when you talked about hardware and software and said there's new hardware, but the software is still old. Maybe this is just different words on the same idea. I do not know much about machines. I just learned to use email by myself now. But what I know from the children of friends of mine, when they get a new computer, they find software. They download it somewhere, I don't know where they get it from, but it will be there in the end. And so this would be a different way of looking at this. If this is a tool, hardware, beyond the current affairs, what do you think might be the nails emerging on the horizon? And it's entirely up to you whether you would want to use 5 or 10 years on the horizon, or if you were willing to go 15 or 20. And it would be very interesting to hear, and I know this is perhaps inherently slightly speculative, but then again, it's an academic institution. And, the third way to think about this broader issue, more general issue of the diplomatic corps, diplomatic service in Europe and the world, let's call it strategy, vision, the vision thing. And this is nothing shocking, or I presume it's nothing shocking. It's almost conventional wisdom that Europe does not have a real strategy. I know there's a document, or the students here know there's a document, but it is not a set preference, nothing formulated anywhere comparable to those states that usually produce them. And this was not closed doors. I mentioned it just by chance. I heard on the same subject matter Pierre Vimont speak less than a year ago at a rather widely known American university, and he was not hesitant to say, yeah, we are setting this up, we are building this up in the absence of a clear, sharp, strong European strategy. And I wonder how you feel this way. Is, again, do you in your hunches, your senses from working closely with this, in the Monet method, will this bring out, affect perhaps a strategy, or will it go the other way around, that you sort of, you're working on the running machine, but the Autobahn is not yet done. I think it's not too much to stretch. So this overall, you pick and choose as you please from this overall, how does it relate to Europe's in the world more generally, more broadly. Another question, or the second issue, has to do with setting this up in the midst of an enormous set of crises. In particular, the EMU crisis, Eurozone crisis, however you want to put it. I would be very interested if you could say more about how this affects setting up the service, but also perhaps the other way around, whether this goes in both ways. Probably not, but you said a few things on this over coffee. And here's a hunch I have, so I would be very, very interested to see what you think about this. Do you sense a tendency within Europe that the particular policy area, policy fields, over the next decade too, will increasingly become more autonomous from one another? So whatever happens to the diplomatic service, to the diplomatic corps, might not fully hang on crises or non-crises in other policy areas, but that the nature of the projects, the nature of the beast might require, but also might generate that in different institutional areas, in different policy areas, there will be increasing autonomy. If so, that surely would open horizons for the service. If you're more hesitant on this, if you're skeptical on this, is this inherently constraining, this enormous set of crises, which quite a few people think, in addition, might be the deepest since the treaties of Paris and Rome. Why don't I stop here? I think that was 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Rory.
Thank you. This was a very interesting presentation, and the EEAS is a subject that I personally find fascinating, so I'm delighted to be here today. The EEAS, it's indeed an institutional experiment, something unheard of in the sphere of diplomacy and foreign policy. It's not totally unheard of, but it is certainly new in more than one sense. The aspect I am personally most interested in is its potential to develop into an actor able to deliver political innovation. Because we all know that foreign policy requires skillful diplomats, and the EEAS has got plenty, but we also know that political leadership and the capacity to turn expertise into political action, a common view into political projects, it's vital. And therefore, I would like to hear more about in what direction you think the EEAS might develop in this respect. And I will clarify my question by using 3 examples. The first one is the Arab uprising that you have been mentioning. This event indeed took everybody by surprise, regardless of what people might say now. And Western countries played catch up, and the EU ended up launching a number of initiatives, nearly all of which were a combined effort of the EEAS and the Commission. And the substance is often summarized in the more for more approach. However, the overall impression is that there is very little politics in all this. And so far, the EU has not been able to produce a new political vision for the new Middle East. And rather than more for more, to put it in a light way, it looks very much like more or less the same. And key issues such as the new role of Islamist parties, for instance, have not been met with a common political understanding within the EU. What is or can be or should be the role of the EEAS in this? Another example, the political agenda. The rotating presidency used to issue an agenda for the following 6 months, and we all knew where the presidency was going to put its chips. The EEAS seemed to inch in that direction, but it does not seem to have developed a consistent way of setting and communicating priorities within a specific time frame. Thus increasing a bit the perception that it reacts rather than shape world affairs. And I wonder whether you see any change coming in that respect. A final example, much more micro. An interesting innovation in the EEAS is the emphasis on political reporting. For the first time, we have EU delegations in non-EU countries expected to regularly report to Brussels with a political analysis of what is going on the ground and recommendations about what could be done. However, if I'm correct, the practice is developing of sharing these reports with member states, turning this into a sort of stock-taking rather than forward-looking analysis. Can we expect this to develop into a proper fact-finding and evidence-gathering type of exercise? Or to put it differently, how political can political reporting be? And this brings me back to my broad question of how political can or should the EEAS be? To use your metaphor of hardware and software, how proactive can the EEAS be in bringing about new software, in presenting member states with potential ideas and innovations that they might go for it, rather than expecting member states to use the EEAS? And a tiny little point sparked by your last point on delegations. I think it is very interesting what is happening in EU delegations because there is a lot is going on, in fact, and I find that very, very interesting. My question here is, to what extent do you think that the heads of delegation taking the presidency is compatible with a full sense of ownership of member states of what goes on there, of European cooperation abroad? Because with the rotating presidency, every ambassador of every big or small member state could expect at one point to be, under the spotlight. With the new system, there is a lot of cooperation and coordination going on, but the risk is that member states sit back and wait for the head of delegations to come up with the solution. And I wonder whether, if you think that this might be a serious risk, or if the EEAS has ways to counter that. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. My comments, I'm not really going to say very much, because I think it's better to leave it to the broader discussion. But I come at the EEAS from the perspective of a lawyer, and as a lawyer, one always starts asking the question, what kind of animal is this really? As you were saying, it's not an institution in the formal sense. It's not it's a body. We're told that it's functionally autonomous. And again, when lawyers read that text, we think, first question, what on earth does functional autonomy mean? What is functional and what is autonomy? And does it mean the same as being separate from the institutions? You were saying, you did in fact say a few words about that, but I think I find it fascinating, and it actually links, it's not a purely esoteric question, because it links to, I think, the points that both Ulrich and Federica were making, in the sense that the EEAS, if it's anything, is supposed to be, I guess, precisely connected with making policy and not making law, because the lawmaking is going on elsewhere in the other institutions. And so we need to look at it as precisely a political body, nearly said institution there, political body, which has this function. But at the same time, as you were saying, when the EEAS starts getting involved in concrete activities, both in Brussels, but also, and maybe even more, in the delegations in third countries, then it starts getting its hands involved in action and in doing things. And then the question of legal status and the question of relationship to the other institutions really becomes, I think, a real question that needs, just to give you one example, the kinds of cases which are going to the court now are cases where you might have a company that's failed to win a tender for a development project in a third country. Who do they, and they want to challenge the procedure. The tender was awarded by the delegation in the third country. Who do they sue? Who is the defendant in an action that they might want to bring? There have been cases like that. The court has said, no, you can't sue the delegation because the delegation is acting here as a delegated authority of the Commission. So we have a functional autonomy of the EEAS, which has its delegations, but when the people in the delegations are doing certain things, then they are the Commission. Legally speaking, they're delegated, acting under delegated powers from the Commission. Now, one can sort that out in legal terms for the people who are, both the people who are acting, but also, I guess, the people with whom they're dealing. These things matter in the end. Who is your interlocutor? Which is the institution you're dealing with? And so I think the question of, perhaps one could put it in terms of accountability, to whom is the EEAS accountable, both in legal terms but also in political terms. And I think the other point that I wanted to make in a way follows on from that, which is to do with the fact that it's quite noticeable to me when I look at the decision on the EEAS, the July 2010 decision, that the tasks of the EEAS are entirely defined in terms of other actors. And this isn't a criticism, this is just a factual, and I can see exactly why. The tasks of the EEAS are defined as supporting, assisting, working in cooperation with, consulting a wide range of other actors, the High Representative in the 3 different roles, 4, you were saying, 3.5, 4 roles that she has, the President of the European Council, the President of the Commission and its services, the diplomatic services of the Member States, the European Parliament, the other institutions, whatever, they're all in there. So it has this, although it's functionally autonomous, it has a kind of dependent role in the sense that it is offering support. And that's as it should be, I think. But I'm wondering to what extent, and this is a little bit going back to the first point you were making about needing to put the bureaucracy together and needing to construct this organization while the engine was still running. Sometimes one gets the impression that in order to find out what the EEAS does, you have to look at the organogram. In other words, you have to look at the structure of the EEAS and you say, oh yes, okay, there are geographic desks, there are certain thematic desks, and that tells you what the EEAS does. And I'm wondering, maybe it's inevitable that it's that way around, but I'm wondering whether that's the right way around. Are we in a situation where the structure is I suppose it's close to the point that Federica was making. Are we in a situation where the structure is defining the policy rather than the policy defining the structure? But maybe that's inevitable. Maybe that's the way diplomatic services should be ordered. So I'll leave it there. Lots and lots of questions. I don't know whether you want to, David, like to come back on any of that right now, or whether we'll it's up to you. I'm happy to hear from you right now on some of those points.
Well, I'd like to, thank you very much. I'd like to let others ask their questions, but let me try just very briefly to pick up on some of those, and they're very wide-ranging, so I will not probably do justice. But I mean, the point you just made and the point Ulrich made about, what is the ultimate sort of raison d'etre of the EEAS, and Federica made the same point. Look, I mean, I come back to the point I made, what is foreign policy anyway? I mean, you could ask that question of any foreign ministry. Foreign ministries do not, dramatically make policy in the sense that they dictate the national interests or the national values of the country they represent. They speak on behalf of a polity, which is a government. In our case, it's the Council, the Member States, and eventually the Commission and the Parliament, depending on how pure CFSP or how mixed you are. And I think whether the nails will appear once we build the hammer, or whether the software will be downloaded legally or illegally, I don't know. But if you look at what has happened in the euro crisis, we've had more integration in the last 2 years, driven by the need to respond to the euro crisis, than we've had in several revisions of the treaty, going back to Lisbon, the Constitution, or even Nice. We've actually taken European integration far deeper in the economic and budgetary field than we could ever have imagined. So I do not exclude that at some point international events may drive us more quickly than we would naturally evolve towards a much more Eurocentric foreign policy and a much greater devolution of authority on foreign policy matters to the center by the member states than will happen incrementally. But this is not something one can predict. And I think the main purpose of the EEAS was simply better to rationalize what was there. I mean, what I think you need to always bear in mind is that all this was going on anyway. The objective was to put it together in a more consistent way, to bring together what the Commission was doing traditionally with what the Council Secretariat was doing. And I didn't talk too much about this, but it's a very important element. The civil and military missions that we've had in Aceh, in Chad, now Atalanta, the naval mission at counter-piracy, what we're about to do in in Mali, where we're going to send a training mission to train the Malian army to eventually have a military intervention with the African Union to retake the northern part of the country, to bring all this together in a more integrated way, because there was a risk that we were developing a bicephalous foreign policy with the Commission doing some sets of things and Solana and the Council Secretary doing others. So the first thing was simply to bring it all together. Now, what develops from that in terms of how ambitious member states are going to be is something I think cannot be predicted at this point. I personally think things may develop much more quickly, driven by events, but I don't know. It's one of Mr. Rumsfeld's unknown, and I think where I think it's a little bit harsh is to say that the EEAS, there's not enough politics. I think there's a lot of politics, but I keep going back and saying, well, it always strikes me as interesting. Hillary Clinton is about to step down as Secretary of State. Well, what would the think tanks say about what she has done as Secretary of State for the last 4 years by comparison with what we've done? I don't know. I don't see any great world problems that have been solved. I don't see, okay, there's the pivot from to Asia, fair enough, okay. We want to see what it means. America has exercised a little bit more or less influence in certain crisis situations, but we have also exercised quite a lot of influence in crisis situations. We've been extremely instrumental, for example, in the Ivory Coast. We played a leading role. I think we're being very active in Mali. Syria is something which confuses us all because nobody quite knows how to deal with the situation. The Middle East problem is as elusive as ever for all of us. I think so. I think how you measure foreign policy and the impact of foreign policy is something that needs to be talked about when you want to talk about what the EEAS is going to do. At the end of the day, to the extent our member states decide to put their weight behind a particular position, whether this is, for example, in Belarus, or whether this is in Ukraine, or whether it is in relation to human rights in other parts of the world, or whether it is for economic reasons, the fact is that the EEAS provides the vehicle, the capacity, the instrument to do that. To the extent that people are divided and we have different views, then, of course, clearly it is more difficult. And I think that it is absolutely right to say that we need to produce innovative thinking. And I think I hinted at this in my introductory remarks. I fully accept that now that we've got the machine up and running, the next thing is indeed to try to take some forward-looking, innovative, I don't know if it's vision or strategy, but this takes a bit of time. You can't just invent this overnight, and I think we will get there. But it's clear that one of the success indices of the EEAS will be its capacity to produce some innovative thinking about foreign policy issues and how best to integrate the different elements that Europe has at its disposal to respond to situations, whether this is trade, aid, humanitarian assistance, possible civilian or military mission intervention, pressure at the United Nations, building international alliances to try to solve problems. This is something we will, I think, get better at because we are gradually putting in place the elements, and we will have to produce these ideas. On the point of, I'm not a lawyer. I'm proud of the fact. My daughter is studying law, unfortunately, but she may decide to become a rock star instead. So maybe, as a father, I'm not entirely sure which fate worries me more. Because I'm from the Sam Goldwyn school of, I never paid a lawyer to tell me what I can't do, but Paolo knows my relationship with the Commission Legal Service when I was there. So. But I don't think there is actually any doubt about the legal status. And the example you chose, Maurice, of a tender in a delegation, it's clear it's the Commission. If it's operational credits, the delegations are acting on behalf of the Commission. If it's administrative credits, it's us. That's what it means to be functionally autonomous. That's what I said. We're responsible for our own budget and for our own staff. But in many cases, we act on behalf of the Commission. We are a delegated authority, and then it's the Commission responsibility which is engaged. So if it's something, we have done wrong as the delegation with our administrative credits, we've fired someone incorrectly, or we have a car accident and someone is injured and it's a question of diplomatic responsibility, then this is us, the EEAS. If it's something which is done with Commission operational credits, it's the Commission. So I don't think it's that difficult to define that. But it is true, and then I will stop because I'm conscious that I'm probably talking for too long already, that we are a new kind of institution, new kind of entity. And that's what I was trying to say earlier about we're chameleon-like. Because there are moments when we're basically a part of the Commission. And there are moments when we're basically a part of the Council Secretariat. And there are moments when we're sort of independent, but leading like the presidency. And we have to develop, this is a new administrative skill. For someone like me who comes from the Commission, and particularly when I did trade, where frankly, I had a lot of authority over the member states, I've had to change a bit my way of dealing with the member states, because frankly, I can't boss them around the way I used to do when I did trade. Equally, I'm trying to encourage our Secretary General colleagues to be a bit tougher, and not to sort of simply take note of the lowest common denominator. Some of our colleagues from the Council Secretariat say to me, well, we've had the tour de table, this is all that's possible. And then I have to say, no, we have to push for a bit more ambition. But not with the same way the Commission would have done it. So we are inventing a new sort of dimension of the European Public Service, which is a hybrid between the Council Secretariat and the Commission. And none of us quite know where this will go. We talked a bit over coffee about the experience of when the Commission set out on the responsibility for trade policy in the 50s and 60s. It was far from evident that the member states accepted the leading role of the Commission, which they now do. It took 20 years for the Commission to establish itself as the sole interlocutor on trade issues, and it's now well established and people cite it as the model, but I can tell you it didn't happen overnight, and it took a lot of skillful work by people going back to Hallstein and Wellenstein and the other people who worked very hard to create this. And I think that's, I'm not implying that we're the inheritors of those great people, but that is what we are doing. And I genuinely think we are creating something new, something quite different. Will it succeed or fail? Frankly, we can only do the best to produce the most professional and effective instrument. The question of whether at the end of the day, member states have the ambition to want to do more collectively and therefore to have more clout for Europe globally, the jury is still out. And I would say on one level, and this is my last thought, the Eurozone crisis is pushing us in that direction, but we also know the corollary of that is that we now have a crisis with the UK. And speaking from a foreign policy perspective, whatever one may think about the UK's position generally, it is clear the EU without the UK is not going to be the same global actor it would be with the UK. The UK and France are the only two countries who have any kind of serious global military reach. And, the UK, France, and Germany are the three countries who really are global actors. So if we lose one of those in some way, and I'm not predicting a departure of the UK from the EU, because actually I don't believe in it, but some kind of greater distance or less engagement on the part of the UK at the European level will undoubtedly weaken our capacity to be a global actor. So there are conflicting trends at work. On the one level, the Euro crisis is driving us toward more integration, and a logical consequence of that would be knock-on consequences for foreign policy. On the other hand, it is also exacerbating an existential crisis with the UK, which in turn could actually weaken our capacity to be a global actor. We clearly need the two permanent members of the Security Council, who are also in the EU, to be on board for most of what we want to do with foreign policy. I'll stop there because maybe I'll pick up some of the other points in response to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Völkel, Robert Schumann Center Borderlands Project. I have a question. How do you see the cooperation between the EU delegations and the national embassies in the third countries? Because once we heard that national embassies do not take the EU delegation serious with the argument, well, we have diplomatic relations for 150, 200 years, and now the EU guys come and want to take over.
Arturo Marzano, the History Department. I think that working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you never realize the lack of foreign policy of the EU so much if you, work there. And I'm thinking whether if you are waiting for the member states to deliver a foreign policy, you will never have in such a topic. So maybe the EEAS should start delivering something. And I think that if you start from practical issues, for example, among the many, the Palestinians who have a dual citizens and who are Palestinians but are EU citizens, and the way in which they have difficulties in traveling and entering. So if you start by tackling practical issues, then you will deliver political issues. So maybe the EEAS should start doing something so that the member state can follow in delivering a foreign policy. Thanks.
My name is Lucas Hakelberg. I'm in the Department of Political and Social Sciences, and I actually have some fresh memories of the External Action Service because I did a traineeship with the Middle East Division 1 in this spring, working mostly on Syria. And what I found kind of striking about our work was that we spent the better part, at least from my point of view, the better part of our work on reacting to the initiatives of other actors, be it member states or even other directorate generals. And the lesser part of elaborating and defending our own initiatives. And I also remember a quote from Pierre Vimont saying that the ambition of the External Action Service was to insert a little music in the concert of European powers. And I was asking myself whether inserting a little music is maybe a bit under-ambitious, and shouldn't the External Action Service aspire to be some kind of conductor in the concert of
Yes, I'm Raffaella Del Sarto from the Robert Schuman Center. It's actually really a follow-up of his question, and I would also like to go back to the Arab Spring and the role of the EEAS in that situation. Actually, it was a question that Federica had also raised, and Ulrich a little bit. I was wondering whether the EEAS really made a difference in the EU's response towards the Arab Spring. I mean, would the EU's response have any difference if the EEAS hadn't existed yet? Or do you think, for the good or for the bad, can go both ways. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that. And also conversely, was there anything that the EEAS learned from dealing with the Arab Spring concretely, in the sense of, next time Mubarak leaves, we know that we have to do this and this and that? I mean, was there something that was really learned from it? Thank you.
On the question of our relations with member state embassies, and Federica asked that point actually also on political reporting, I actually think this is one of the success stories, and I don't detect, and I travel a lot around the world, and I always make a point of meeting with the member state embassies locally, wherever I travel, either to brief them on what I've been doing or just to have the opportunity to talk to them. And I don't think that the attitude you described is generalized. I think the reaction I've got from member state embassies around the world is extremely positive. Firstly, saying it's very useful to have an EU delegation, that the EU delegation has taken over the presidency role very effectively. There are some resource constraints, of course, and that's another point that Federica made, and I owe her an answer on that. But I think member states do look to the EU delegation for a point of focus and a point of leadership. Of course, they continue to have their bilateral contacts. Let's be honest, in Washington, I don't think the British or the French or the German ambassadors think that they need to go through the EU delegation to convey their views to the State Department or to the White House. This is clear. I think the situation is quite different when you move down the international food chain to, countries in Africa which are going through a crisis, or in Latin America. So I think it is clear that the role of our delegations probably increases in importance in inverse proportionality to the sort of strategic importance of the country, because their member states still want to be very active. Moscow or Beijing it would be the same. So I think, and remember the statistics I gave you, that in the vast majority of countries, there are only a couple of member states present, and frankly, they're often very grateful to have the EU delegation and have high expectations of the EU delegation. And the big question is in what way the existence of a European network enables member states to think differently about their bilateral diplomatic presence. One of the things we're pushing very hard on is co-location of member state embassies with EU delegations, offering the possibility for member states to have a limited diplomatic presence, say just one diplomat, but based in the EU delegation, plus the fact that with the services we can offer to non-resident member state diplomats who visit the country, who are very pleased to have an EU delegation where they can find an office and an IT system and an administrative backup and sometimes security assistance. So I think the existence of the diplomatic network is going to dramatically change the way member states think about their bilateral diplomatic presence, and I think there's a lot of evidence that that's already happening, driven in large measure by the financial crisis. And in terms of the political reporting point that Federica made, I mean, firstly, I don't, maybe this is now my sort of old commission background, I don't think that there was no political reporting before. I think commission delegations actually did quite a lot of political reporting. But it's true, it wasn't their main purpose in life. And more importantly, from the perspective of the commission, the delegations were not core business. That's the big difference with the existence of the EEAS. For the Commission, which is largely focused on domestic European issues, of course, as they should be, the delegations were an interesting, slightly exotic addition to what they had, focused mainly on things like aid and trade, but they weren't in the forefront of anybody's minds. The Copernican revolution that the EEAS has created is now the headquarters should revolve around the delegations, not the other way around. The jewel in our crown is our diplomatic network. And this is dramatically changing the way we interface with delegations, who in my view should do much more policy shaping. They should be much more involved in helping us think about policies with regions, because they have the local knowledge. And we're relying much, much more on delegations for policy shaping than we were in the past. And on the political reporting, I think there are three kinds of political reporting that happen. One is that the delegation routinely writes its assessment of what is happening, and that is written on the authority of the head of delegation, and is shared with the member states. Secondly, there's a lot of joint reporting that goes on with the heads of mission present locally, so they produce joint reports and common analysis of the situation, and this is also shared with all other member states. And these are actually very useful, very valuable. I think it's very good when we can get that kind of information shared with a shared report of our heads of mission. Equally, our delegations produce good quality reports, which are particularly valuable. Let's take a country where there's only 3 or 4 member states present. It's very valuable for the countries who are not present to have access to the EU delegation reporting. And this is something much appreciated by the member states. And thirdly, to be frank, there is private, confidential reporting by heads of delegation, which we don't share with anyone, because it's precisely they have some information, or they've had some conversations, or they have some thoughts which we don't immediately share with the member states. So they are perfectly free, if they feel the need, to produce some more confidential recommendations to Brussels, which we might want to test and think about in Brussels before we would share with the member states or move to some kind of initiative. On the question of do we react, or to what extent we react or we lead? Well, I mean, the fact is that most people, when events happen rapidly, most people are reacting. The events in Gaza, who was not reacting? Sorry, the Americans were reacting, the Egyptians were reacting, everyone was reacting. So it's not particularly surprising that, when a crisis develops, much of your time is spent reacting to the latest stage of the crisis, because you can't predict what's going to happen. You don't know when the bomb's going to go off. You don't know who's going to get assassinated. You don't know when there's going to be some kind of horrible humanitarian consequence of what is happening that needs to be addressed. So, I mean, you have your experience, and I think I understand what you're saying. But one of the things that foreign ministries do is react to changing events. And they don't always get ahead of the curve. I mean, even the United States doesn't always get ahead of the curve. They are frequently in the same situation. Now, we are probably a bit further back than long-established, experienced diplomatic or national actors, also because our ability to initiate, we have to go through the member states. So we are by definition slower. We can't simply decide, Cathy Ashton cannot simply decide in a way, say that Hillary Clinton could, checking with the White House, and then bang, we do this. We have to consult the member states. So we're always going to be a bit slower. But that's the price we pay for the structure we have, and I think it's not a fatal weakness, but you know, it definitely means that sometimes it takes a bit more time. And on the question of, what did we make a difference? This is a question I'm often asked, did we make a difference? Well, I don't want to give a false answer. I'm not going to say, oh yes, it made a huge difference having the EEAS. I think it did help bring together, as Cathy Ashton likes to say, the politics and the economics better than would have happened in the absence of the EEAS, yes. Cathy also likes to say that the creation of the EEAS was not so much a grab for power as a grab for efficiency. And I mean, in the first phase, that's what we are about. I mean, I really need to emphasize this. We were not set up to kind of completely reinvent European foreign policy. We were set up to try to better connect the dots between how you would respond via humanitarian aid run by the Commission, via development assistance, run in the long term by DevCo, but in the short term by the EEAS through the Instrument for Stability or some of the short-term measures which we can do. The possibility to have military or civil mission intervention, and the possibility to have some kind of better common analysis with the member states of what the problem is and how Europe can react. And I think I can make a case that we have shown that this works a bit better now than it did 2 years ago. But of course, it's not a dramatic change, because I go back to my point about the software. People still basically want the same kind of foreign policy we've had before. They just want to do it more efficiently and more effectively. And the more we do it efficiently and effectively, in my view, I'm not sounding like Kevin Costner now, build it and they will come, but it is a bit to that. It becomes a magnet for people saying, well, actually, we have something here that works. And I think one of the things we have definitely learned in the last 2 years, for example, is crisis response, where now we have put in place a system of a crisis platform, which we convene the minute a crisis breaks out, which brings together the Commission, ECHO, the different parts of the EEAS with different responsibilities, the civilian, the military, the geographical and the political, to make sure that we have a common analysis of what is happening, and a capacity to react and to respond. And if I take, for example, Syria, our delegation is one of the few diplomatic presences still left in Damascus. Many member states close their embassies and move their diplomats into our delegation in Damascus, and we have become the focal point for the European presence in Syria in a very difficult and delicate situation. I'm not sure how much longer we can hold out there because the security situation is deteriorating. But I think this shows this would not have happened previously if that was still the Commission delegation. I can tell you if it had been the Commission delegation, they would have been pulled out 3 months ago. So I think, yes, we are making a difference, but it is not, I don't want to oversell it either, because the one thing I don't want to do is go around pretending that everything is now perfect and we have this wonderful external action service and it's all great. No, there's a lot of work to be done, but I do believe that it is slowly but surely changing the dynamics of the way we create foreign policy at the European level and enhancing our capacity to implement the foreign policy initiatives that member states respond to.
Thank you. Yes. Perhaps if you
Human Rights, and the collaboration that it will have with the External Action Service in increasing the effectiveness and visibility of the human rights policy towards the outer world.
Hi. Thank you for your very interesting conversation this morning with us. I would be interested perhaps in a practical example of an international event that you could see it coming, actually, like the creation of a new state, South Sudan, where something that started before the creation of the service, before the entry into force of Lisbon, and that has actually happened after that creation and after the Council decision. Is that perhaps a scenario where the EEAS can make a difference? Is that perhaps a particular field where the EEAS can say, I will be the one leading the reaction of the EU, the creation of South Sudan, a new state? And if, whether that's or not the case, if perhaps you could give us an idea of how the dynamic of the EU reaction in that case took place, in the sense of what's the role in such a scenario for the EEAS? Is the EEAS calling everyone, say what the reaction is going to be, or is the EEAS going to meetings that are held somewhere in the Commission or in the Council, where the EEAS is just one more actor? Thank you.
Thank you, Delina Dinolfi, University of Florence. I'm here part-time now. So you mentioned, I think, a very significant issue that concerning the definition of foreign policy. But I'm a lawyer, and lawyers are always very interested in definitions. But apart that, I think that in this case, this definition has very important, very significant implications, namely with regard to a principle, the principle of coherence and consistency of action of the Union that should be complied with on the basis of the new treaties. I think that a very rigorous definition of foreign policy could be very negative implications as far as this principle of coherence is concerned, of course, and less linked to development policy, of course, and to some other policies that have of course, different implications, both in foreign policy and in concrete action of the European Union. So is this just a legal problem, or do you think in your inside view that there are some boundaries problems as far as the definition of foreign policy is concerned? Thank you very much.
Yes, my name is Joris Larek, also from the Law Department. I just had a question concerning how the EEAS deals with confidential information, because you mentioned it yourself, sometimes you don't want to share it all, and one of the main functions of the service is really to gather information, relay information, distribute information. But something, it's not, if we really talk about rather sensitive security-oriented information, it's not something, if I recall correctly, that worked perfectly well before the Lisbon Treaty. There's an EU restricted label and certain capabilities for protecting that, but is there a potential for the EEAS to improve that situation, or will that be something that will remain outside of it, something more intergovernmental, or something the member states will continue to do in terms of really intelligence sharing, sort of Club of Bern type of thing that the EEAS will have nothing to do with, or will the EEAS increasingly take that over, and how? Thanks.
My name is Hans Miklitz. I'm in the Law Department. I have two questions. So the lawyer coming in the end, as you can see. Always. Lawyers are a kind of a... You know, lawyers are a kind of a repair service, so I think that's why they're coming in the end. So I have two types of questions. So I think one of your remarks concerned how the role and function of national diplomacies or foreign ministries had changed. Yeah? So that's, I think, a general observation, but for somebody like me working in economic law, it's just amazing that everything is just, all sorts of problems are solved within competent ministries, and the foreign relations units are more or less out. So, and then, let's say the question I have is the following. can this establishment of this new unit in the European Commission be understood as a kind of a rollback? Is it a kind of, let's say, is it politicizing the economy, or is it economizing diplomacy? Or so this is one question. And the other one is on the relationship between institutions and substance. So you said relatively bluntly, let me put it like this, we have three categories of countries around the world. One where the major European players are all represented, and then we have the 10 countries benchmark and the 5 countries benchmark. So I'm just wondering to what extent this classification or these simple facts, yeah, that member states give up or do not settle or do not establish units in certain countries, to what extent this creates a particular leeway for your service to develop a policy in between these countries, but also towards, let's say, the first category. Yeah? So let's say, to be more concrete, we all can imagine, and I think we have our prejudices where member states have their priorities. They all go to the US, but they may be less interested in certain states in Africa. Yeah? So then you have these, I think you might have then a stronger role to play in those areas where member states are underrepresented, or is that wrong?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Chantal Lavallee. I'm visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman. Thank you for your interesting presentation. My question is about the coordination among different actors, and for sure the European External Action Service have an added value and the integrated approach of the EU, but so far I evaluate the relation between civilian and military actors, so between the EEAS and the political military organ who are on the organizational chart, but not legally in the structure. So all the relation evaluate. Thank you.
Jurek Dudek, Law Department. You mentioned one challenge, connecting the dots between the internal and the external sphere of policies. And you gave an example, Russian policy towards Russia and energy issues. So let me stay with this example. Could you just elaborate more how the issues connected to external energy policy are being worked out with the DG Energy? What kind of role does EEAS play here?
Okay, so we're here till tea time then, aren't we? Yes, okay. On the European Special Representative for Human Rights, I should maybe say a few words about the animal of European Union Special Representative, which is an instrument under the CFSP budget, which has, to be frank, a certain budgetary advantage for us because it means we can create political actors with some staff around them which do not come out of our administrative budget, and in a situation where we are very short-staffed and under pressure, this provides a valuable extension of our reach. It is also true that these people have a sort of political profile, normally in relation to regional issues. I mean, we have an EU Special Representative for the Caucasus, we have one for Sudan, we have, so traditionally the emphasis has been on geography. And these are people who have the time and the possibility to spend a lot of time in the region, to do a lot of networking, and it's a very valuable addition to what we do. This is the first time we've done it thematically for human rights, because this is a very important issue which we want to see mainstreamed. Stavros Lambrinidis works very closely with our human rights team, and of course ultimately has the same policy because we all work for the High Representative Vice President, so, you know, and it is a useful additional not quite political figure, but a slightly more visible figure than officials can sometimes be, who can project our policy, but also collect information and have contacts with different actors to see how we can respond. Now, obviously doing it for something thematic is a bit more complicated, and we have to see how we manage this, and this will be something we'll need to learn from experience as to how this can be used. But already, whether it is in relation, for example, to Myanmar, the recent resolution we had in Geneva, where for the first time we managed to actually get a consensus resolution around an EU draft with all of the members of the Human Rights Committee supporting it. Traditionally a rather critical resolution of human rights in Myanmar, this time being rather more positive, rightly so. And Stavros played an important role in helping with that. So I think this is a positive development. You asked me for an example of Sudan, or I think what the EEAS brings, whether it's Sudan or whether it's now what's happening in Mali, or is that we are the people who convene the coordinating meeting. That's the way it works. And we put on the table all the issues, the Commission DGs come, all the different constituent parts of the EEAS are there. So we have the military, and I'll come back to your question on that in a moment. We have the military around the table, we have the civilian mission people around the table, we have the geography around the table. And frankly, that didn't happen in the past. The Commission would organize its own inter-service cooperation, the colleagues in the Council would do their thing, maybe there would be a few conversations between the two, but what we have changed is there is literally a room like this where we have everyone around the table who has anything to say about the issue, from whatever perspective, humanitarian, development assistance, trade, if energy is an issue or whatever. So we are capable, I think, of producing a more integrated approach. Now, is the result dramatically different than it might otherwise have been? Well, it's hard to, that's again for academics and to do the control experiment and try to see. But I do believe that this is producing a rather more transparent way of making policy vis-a-vis situations than was there before, and a more integrated and joined up approach. Does this necessarily make us more effective? Well, that can also depend on events, sometimes beyond our control. But I think it is changing the way of working. For example, coming back to Russia, in the run-up to summits, I regularly convene all the interested directors general of the Commission to discuss our policy with Russia. It's the EEAS which explains in Coreper the approach we're going to take at the summit. The Commission, of course, comes in support. And at the summits, we basically work directly for President Van Rompuy and for President Barroso, as well as for Cathy Ashton. So we're also providing a service to the two presidencies in terms of connecting the dots and presenting an integrated view, able to bring together also intelligence from our delegation. So I think this is all working better than it did before. Now, can I prove that therefore we have quite different results and better results? The answer is no, frankly, because in the absence of a controlled experiment of not having done it, I don't know what would have been the outcome. But I think this is a better way of doing business than we did before. On the question of the definition of foreign policy, I think you understand, I fully agree. I think that we should not have a narrow definition. The whole point, the logic of the External Action Service is that we take the broad definition, which is everything that's happening in the world around us. And this goes to your point about are we economizing the politics or politicizing the economics? The fact is, it's all a part of a foreign policy projection. And I think the one thing we have to fight to avoid is that the service is pushed into a CFSP ghetto, and that we're deemed only that we deal with CFSP in the traditional sense, but it's the Commission or other actors who deal with the other stuff. And that is not the way we see it. It's not the way the High Representative / Vice President role was conceived. And I think, Cathy sometimes says, I don't want to be Solana with embassies, because I want to also show that, on the global issues, on trade, on development, on the external projection of internal policies, we need to bring this together in an integrated way. Now, it's not simple. If I take the example, for example, of the emission trading scheme, where we succeeded with our proposal to include air travel, air traffic in our emissions trading scheme, we managed to create a global alliance of Russia, China, Cuba, India, all united against our proposal. This was quite a diplomatic achievement. But it is true that in terms of how we extricate ourselves from that, we worked very closely with DG Klima, but at the end of the day, they were the ones who were in the driving seat in terms of trying to find a way out through the work in ICAO, and now we've been able to suspend the measure for temporarily, and we've temporarily brought some peace to the valley. But so there will always be a mixture of a division of labor between the EEAS and Commission sectoral DGs. But what works very well is the exchange of information. They rely heavily on our delegations, work with our delegations, and I think this is mutually reinforcing. So I think, but we need to go with the broad definition. Confidential information is a challenge. First of all, let's be clear, we don't have an intelligence service. We do not have an independent capacity to collect confidential information in the way that many member states do, frankly, through spies, if you want to call them that, or whatever they are, people who are trained to collect this kind of information. We have no such capacity. We don't have our spies. We may have somebody else's spies, but we don't have our own. And I don't think we're going to have this anytime soon. Just as, by the way, we don't have a police force and we don't have a military. So when I'm looking at providing security to our delegation in Afghanistan or in our delegation in Iraq, I have to use private security companies. I have no choice. I don't have an option of asking the gendarme or the military to help protect our staff. So we spend a very large sums of money on private security firms, because we have no choice. Equally, we have no intelligence service, so we don't collect security-sensitive intelligence information. We are sometimes in receipt of such information from member states, and we have fairly sophisticated procedures for dealing with that, so sophisticated that sometimes it's difficult to get your hands on the information, even if you knew it existed, so it's quite tricky, because you will say, well, someone will say, oh, well, there was a very interesting confidential report on this, and you say, well, why didn't I know about it? Well, it's confidential. So, I mean, there's always a bit of tension between transparency and keeping information so confidential that no one ever sees it, which is what I think some of the intelligence agencies would like us to do. And there is, as we were discussing over coffee earlier, there's an inherent tension with the fact that we are nonetheless subject to the basic pressure for transparency with member states. Member states don't like the idea that we keep secrets from them, and once we give things to 27 member states, to be honest with you, it might as well be in the public domain. I mean, you can say it's confidential, but I mean, we've had two examples recently. I was doing some negotiations with Switzerland, and I was supposed to go to Bern 2 days before I traveled. My negotiating position was all over the newspapers because it had been shared, in this case inside the Commission, with a working group, and it had leaked. We're in the middle of difficult trade negotiations with Canada. The Commission had prepared a sort of secret document and given to member states of our red lines for the final phase of the negotiation. Next day it was in the newspaper. So, I mean, if you work in the European institutions, confidentiality is a relative notion, and frankly, we have to accept this, because we're not going to turn ourselves into the CIA or MI6 or the German or French equivalents. But we have to demonstrate, and I think this is important, that we have the capacity to protect sensitive information when we are given it. Unfortunately, we can't ask the same from the member states. Changing role of foreign ministries. I mean, I think this is. I mean, there is an existential dilemma about the role of diplomacy. Because it's clear the traditional view that an embassy was, in a country, might take 2 years for a message to get to the country. The diplomat could act on it in 2 years for the reply to get back. Now, as I say, prime ministers text each other, send each other email messages, pick up mobile phones and have conversations immediately. Ambassadors have to adapt to this. Embassies adapt to this. But I nonetheless think that, and clearly, diplomats have to become much more conversant with the language of economics and international trade and finance than was the case 100 years ago. And I agree with you that it is probable that we are able to be more effective in those countries where there is less self-evident member state interest across the board. It is clear that relations with the US, I mean, if I take the United States as an example, every member state thinks they have a privileged relation with the United States, and every Commission DG is convinced that they have a privileged relationship with their counterpart in the US. So do they really need the EEAS to help them? Do they really need the delegation in Washington? This is a struggle. By the way, you talk to any US desk in any national foreign ministry and they will tell you they have exactly the same problem. Because everyone goes to Washington, it's impossible even to keep track of how many people are in Washington at any given point in time. So it's clear, countries like Washington, Russia, Beijing, New Delhi, Tokyo, these are places where we're going to be struggling to keep up with the level of bilateral and indeed sectoral activity which is happening. It's clear that in countries where there is a lesser presence or where the EU is a more important actor, then of course we can have more influence or a bigger role is permitted. This doesn't mean that we should not. For example, in the case of Russia, obviously we do play an important role. This is an area where we're coordinating very closely across the full range of issues with Russia, including energy. We work very closely with DG Energy. They often come to us with their problems, saying, look, we're having a problem. Sometimes we can try to help. Sometimes we can use our influence, and we have very good exchanges of information. But of course, the ultimate question in this area is, to what extent does the European Union do trade-offs in the way that member states sometimes try to do? In other words, with the Chinese, you can say, well, if I do something for you on market economy status, are you prepared to give us greater access in the area of investment for our businesses? This is something that big countries do all the time. The EU doesn't do it well because we have sectoral interests, and getting a concerted EU position is not simple. Let me give you another illustration. India. There's only one thing India would like from us. That is support for their permanent seat on the Security Council. That's the one thing we can't deliver because we don't have a common EU position, for reasons Pasquale will know. So when the Indians talk to us about international diplomacy, they're very nice, but they will tell you, you can't help me with my single biggest foreign policy objective, which is to garner international support for a permanent seat on the Security Council. Well, we can't, is the answer. Does this mean we can't have relations with India? Of course, but it just shows that India still views the EU through the prism of trade and trade relations and economic relations. They don't necessarily take us seriously as a political actor because they feel on the one foreign policy thing that they would like to have a movement, we are not able to be the interlocutor they would like. With Russia, it's a bit the same. Putin is able to look across the full range of issues and to imagine, well, if you give me a bit of that, I can give you a bit of that. And he gets frustrated that on the EU side, we're not able to play that game because our system doesn't permit us to sell out, if you like, something on energy in return for something on trade or something on foreign policy cooperation in return for something on human rights or whatever. And this is a challenge for the EU. Going back to my software question, the heads of state and government for the moment have been extremely preoccupied with the Eurozone crisis. I hope at some point, when we get through this crisis, as I'm absolutely convinced we will, the European Council can once again turn its mind a bit more to foreign policy and to addressing some of these issues, which frankly can only be discussed at the level of Chefsaka, at the level of the heads of state and government, to see to what extent Europe wants in the 21st century to be a global player rather than a regional player, and to be able to make those kinds of trade-offs and deals with countries in order to have influence. And this is a big open question on which, in my view, the future of our continent probably hinges in the next 20 or 30 years. Finally, on the crisis management structures, this is something I discovered when I joined the EEAS. We've got 300 soldiers, military people, very nice, they salute. And when you go to a meeting with them, I can tell you the meeting starts on time, the meeting ends on time. But all joking aside, we are working very hard on blending all of this together. It isn't easy because people come from these different structures, but the military add huge value added to our discussions, for example, on what to do in Mali or what to do in Libya. And I think this is again one of the success stories is that we are, even though formally speaking, you're right, they have a slightly different status within the EEAS. They are increasingly a part of the family, also with the Civil and Military Planning Department and the Civil Police and Civilian Capacity. We are increasingly able to bring all these elements together and produce what we call a comprehensive EU response, which runs from the full spectrum of options open to the EU, from the traditional humanitarian to development to trade to military intervention to civilian intervention to training missions. And I think this comprehensive approach, on which we will be producing a new paper very shortly, is undoubtedly going to be one of the themes of the next period. So I think, yes, this is one of our success stories. Of course, it takes a certain amount of time. Also because, and this is my last point, on the Council side, the structures are still very heavy. They have a lot of working groups. I mean, my civilian mission colleagues tell me they're very understaffed because they've been asked to do 3 or 4 new missions. And when I looked into it, I discovered there were 4 or 5 council groups controlling what they were doing. So I went to the member states and I said, look, we've got a staffing problem. I said, couldn't you just have one committee looking at this and then send me some of those people you have in those committees to actually work on the mission? The response was not overwhelmingly enthusiastic, but I think on the Council side there needs to be also some streamlining and some connecting of the dots, because there are the Political and Security Committee works well, but the structures underneath seem to me still a bit complicated and based on an old-fashioned view of how this should all function. So I think there's still a lot of rationalization, scope for rationalization and streamlining, both also on the Council side. But in general, it works rather well. So I mean, you know, this is work on progress. But what I would like, the thought I would like to leave you with is that I do believe this is a very exciting development. I don't think it's going to change the shape of the 21st century single-handedly, but I think it will and is significantly affecting our capacity to act with greater consistency and with greater effectiveness. And I think we can produce a professional and efficient and value for money diplomatic service which complements what the member states do. We do not want to be the 28th or the 29th member state. We want to work with them and complement what they do. But whether Europe and its citizens are ready to assume the consequences of a wish to be a global actor in the 21st century is something which I fear our national politicians have not yet confronted our citizens with the question in those terms. And sometime we're going to have that conversation with our citizens, because otherwise it is clear, no matter what the External Action Service does, we will gradually become less and less relevant as other more effective and more powerful actors shape the 21st century, and we risk to be left behind. So nothing has changed since President Delors said that the process of European integration was a race for the old continent between influence and irrelevance. And this is as true today as it was when he said it sometime back in the 1980s. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I think that was a really fascinating 2 hours. A bit of we put you through quite a lot of.
Did I pass?
Yeah. But there was a huge amount of I think very, very interesting information and thoughtful thinking about what's happening with the EEAS and what might happen in the future with the EEAS. As you can see, there are a lot of people here who are interested in the subject from a number of different departments, coming at it from different perspectives, and it was really very valuable, I think, to have you here. So I'm really grateful that you gave the time to come here. Thank you again.